Hello, everyone. Hello, Dr. Eben. Hello, Sharon.
Hello, Mira. Hello, Dr. Eben. It's such an honor to have you here. I
Well,
can't wait to hear.
Mira and Sharon, it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
Your story is beyond remarkable, beyond extraordinary. And the transformation that you experienced, not only in your coma, but then as consciousness, as understanding of the world, is truly something that I cannot wait to hear your thoughts on, right? I've gotten a glimpse of it as I've heard you speak, but I'm excited to bring that to our listeners. So I know it all started with an experience of near death, coma with a near-death experience. So please take us right into all of it.
Okay, well, I think the important thing to point out is who I was before. I was an academic neurosurgeon. I'd spent more than 15 years teaching neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School and then also additional years at other places. Thought I understood something about brain, mind, consciousness, and the nature of reality. I'd always been very much a scientist. And so when I had this extraordinary experience during a week-long coma, due to a severe gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis back in November of 2008, it really shocked me. It was the exact opposite of what I would have expected, as a materialist neuroscientist who believed the brain creates consciousness. Now, one important thing to stress is an atypical feature of my near-death experience that you usually don't hear about in these kind of experiences is that I was amnesic. I had no memory of Eben Alexander's life. I had no knowledge of Earth, this universe. It really was an empty slate. And it took me months and months after the coma, after waking up from it, when I was going through a deep investigation into the nature of my coma and the nature of consciousness, that I finally kind of uncovered why that amnesia would be so important. And it really had to do with my accepting it. If it had followed a more traditional course and for example, if I had scripted it, my adoptive father, who had passed over 4 years before my coma, he would have been there, but he was nowhere to be found. And as I will tell, I had a very different kind of spiritual guide. And she was important at kind of demonstrating the reality of the overall journey to me. So let me take you back to what I experienced, early that morning of November 10th, 2008, when I woke up with severe back pain, headache. Soon thereafter, lapsed into coma, grand mal seizures, all happening at home. There's a myth out in the lay press around my case claiming that I had a medically induced coma. But the reason the scientific community takes my coma so seriously is because the nature of it, because this kind of meningitis is a perfect model for human death because of its impact on the neocortex, the outer surface of the brain. And in fact, the medical case report written on my medical records that came out in September 2018 in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases really confirmed and validated so much of what I had said in the book Proof of Heaven, but especially the fact that the objective scientific data revealed that that brain could not have harbored any kind of dream or hallucination, much less the most profound, detailed, memorable, transformative spiritual experience of my entire life. That all happened at a time when the medical facts showed that my brain was offline. And that's why the scientific community takes the story so seriously. Now, what I saw of that experience from the inside, and again, in this setting of amnesia, where I had no knowledge of Earth or this universe or the life of Eben Alexander, it started in what I call the earthworm eye view, a very primitive course on responsive realm. It was like being in dirty jello. I do remember kind of sensing roots or blood vessels all around me, and I sensed that it seemed to go for a very long time because I don't believe I had any kind of memory of moment to moment. But luckily, it didn't go forever, and I was rescued by this slowly spinning white light. And it came packaged with a perfect musical melody. And that light presented to me, it had a kind of a ground glass appearance to it, and it was very slowly spinning and had these fine silvery and golden tendrils surrounding it. And as that light came towards me, it opened up like a rip in the fabric of that ugly earthworm's eye view and led me up into this brilliant, ultra-real gateway valley. Now, the interesting thing about that people must understand, many people think that a near-death experience would be kind of vague and dreamy and murky compared to this. But in fact, this realm, this material realm, is kind of dreamlike and murky compared to that realm. That realm is far more sharp, crisp, alive, vibrant, meaningful, and powerful compared to what we go through in this life. And also important to point out, for example, that as I ascended into this higher level, this Gateway Valley, I realized that it was a rich spiritual realm. It was filled with a lot of kind of earth-like features, but also it's the realm, for example, where we would reunite with our higher souls, with souls of departed loved ones, go through things like life reviews. And important to state that life review is far more kind of exotic when you study it scientifically. Because that life review is, you can see your birth, death, everything in between, all simultaneously. So that realm is not stuck in our little earth time and this kind of plodding river flow of time that we sense in this world, but it's a much more vibrant, dynamic realm of kind of causal relationships that I call deep time or meta time. Very important to understand that. If you don't understand that, you're not even beginning to grasp the power of this spiritual realm. The other thing about life reviews that's so important is that we experience them from the perspective of all involved in our life events, not just our own perspective. So it shows us that we're, if we hurt another, we're hurting ourselves. And that's what we sense in that life review. But those are kind of the big rules that people have to understand about this to fully get the power of these kind of journeys. Now, in this Gateway Valley, I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. There were millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in vast formations, colors beyond the rainbow. And down below was this lovely meadow surrounded by a rich forest. There were sparkling waterfalls into crystal blue pools. And I remember seeing thousands of beings dancing. And in the writings that I did weeks later, as I was trying to record all this, I said there were souls between lives. That's basically how I interpreted this incredible scene I was witnessing. But the amazing thing is it was filled with joy and festivity. And a lot of that was because it was being fueled, because up above were these swooping orbs of pure angelic beings. They looked like perfect kind of ovals, and they were looping and spiraling together up in the skies above, emanating chants and anthems, hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. And the amazing thing about all this description I'm giving you is that it seemed like a spiritual home. Some of the words may sound a bit foreign, but I can tell you the way it was presented in the book Proof of Heaven woke thousands of people up to share with me their own similar experiences. So there was enough of an echo and a resonance in my telling of the story that many, many people, it was like, and they would come to me, I've never told anybody this before, and they would share the same, similar kind of experience that they'd had. So the similarities were what struck me in the months afterwards as people would communicate when I started sharing my journey, the similarities. So on this butterfly wing, I remember this soft summer breeze that blew through, and that was my first awareness of the divine, of that infinitely loving God force that was present all through this realm. And I cannot tell you how comforting that was. That soft summer breeze, which I call the divine wind or the breath of God in my early writings, that was exactly what it was. And that awareness came in that setting of amnesia where I had no kind of religious beliefs or any memories of existence in this universe. And now all of a sudden I realized the power of that infinitely loving God force. And that is, of course, what is so reassuring to near-death experiencers going back thousands of years, whether they have any kind of religious system or be atheist, agnostic, what have you. Going through these experiences, more than 90% of souls who have been through this come back to this world realizing there is a loving, powerful, benevolent force at the core of the universe, that universal love, that God force that's right there. It's our source of conscious awareness. We're never separate from us. And that realization was beautiful. And yet it was something that I realized many other near-death experiencers have come back with. That's why they don't fear death at all. They realize it's a transition to kind of a higher state of awareness. It's a liberation from the shackles of the prison of the body and the brain and the material world into a much higher level. And of course, the good news these days, as Karen Newell, my partner and the co-author of our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, and I go around sharing meditation workshops because we realize that you don't have to have your own NDE to get all of this. By exploring consciousness, having powerful meditative tools, that's how all of us can come into this knowledge. Now, Gateway Valley, as I said, that means it's going somewhere. It's not an endpoint of this journey. And I remember seeing what happened next was the angelic choirs above provided yet another musical portal to higher and higher levels. And how I witnessed all that was that all of four-dimensional space-time, the lowest levels of existence, were collapsing down. And then all of that spiritual level of the Gateway Valley, including that metatime or deep time, that kind of causal relationship that allows our entire lives to unfold simultaneously in a different higher order causal kind of temporal framework, all of that collapsing down. And every bit of that was present to me as what I call the oversphere, which was basically the universe throughout all of eternity as a complex teaching tool that was there in the core realm. That's where I had now arrived, the highest level I achieved in this journey, where all dualities have resolved, darkness and light, masculine, feminine, good, evil. Every bit of the dualities of this realm resolve into that oneness. And I recognize that oneness of that God force as a source of conscious awareness, an incredible vision. And in that core realm, which I often describe as a dazzling darkness because it was a complete resolution of all paradoxes and dualities into this pure oneness so that I could actually see how the universe kind of emerges from that oneness of that primordial, infinitely loving and co-creative God force. And in that core realm, I witnessed a brilliant orb of light that I saw as a translator or interpreter. Now, important to point out that down in the Gateway Valley realm, on the butterfly wing, I had not been alone. There was a beautiful young woman, sparkling blue eyes, high cheekbones, high forehead, broad smile, soft brown hair framing her lovely face. She was dressed in the same kind of simple yet very colorful garb that all those beings dancing in the meadow down below were dressed in. And that guardian angel, as I came to call her, who had been on that butterfly wing, had given me the most important message of the entire journey that I think I was to bring back to this world and share with all fellow beings. And that was one of the main reasons I wrote the book Proof of Heaven, especially after I obtained the scientific proof that it had to be a true encounter, in the spiritual realms, and did not have any default explanations that I was seeking in the material realm as a neuroscientist, a brain scientist. I needed to reach much deeper to get to these answers. And that guardian angel, her message to me, you are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are deeply cared for, and you can do no wrong. I put those words in book Proof of Heaven. I wish I'd explained that last phrase much more fully because people misinterpret it the way I wrote the story. So that's my fault for not doing a better job of it. But by the time I was on that butterfly wing with that beautiful guardian angel, witnessing all this love and heard that you can do no wrong, what I realized was that was the message, that we have free will, that this infinitely loving God force is the co-creator of our emerging reality, but we are the ones with the free will to make the decisions and to learn and teach from those actions. And I already realized through this ambience of love that I was experiencing that it was all about love. So when I said you can do no wrong, that reflected that I already knew that the most ideal pathway forward as a journeying soul was one where I manifested unconditional love, kindness, compassion, mercy, acceptance, when necessary, forgiveness. And of course, always remembering gratitude. Every bit of that is the formula of you can do no wrong. It doesn't mean we can do anything we want to others, because if we choose to hand out pain and suffering, then basically when we go through that life review, we're going to be on the receiving end of that. That's what the life review is all about. It's the golden rule written into the fabric of the universe. Treat others as you would like to be treated. And near-death experiences have been teaching this lesson to us for thousands of years. For example, go back to the writings of Plato. and the Armenian soldier killed in battle 2,400 years ago, who told his fellow soldiers when he came back to life after a few days dead on the battlefield, that when you die, your life flashes before your eyes, and you find that the only important thing was how much love you were able to share with your fellow beings. So that from 2,400 years ago could still be a story told today on a battlefield of our modern world. But it's really all about that love. That's the chief message of near-death experiences. And as the scientific community begins to study these kinds of experiences and start to prove the reality of them and how they fit into a much bigger picture of the human condition in our modern era, we realize that that materialist model is a false model. Anyway, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but let's go back to the story. So it turns out every time I entered that core realm, I was told, you're not here to stay. We'll be sending you back, but we'll teach you many things. Not in words, pure conceptual flow, but those were the words that I wrote down to report and convey that message every time I entered the core realm. And what would happen is I'd spontaneously tumble back down to that earthworm eye view. But it was by remembering the musical notes of the melody that I could conjure up that light portal, go back up into the Gateway Valley, always welcomed by that lovely guardian angel on the butterfly wing. And the same beautiful message. And a lot of the lessons were taught there, but many of them were taught in that highest level of the core realm. And I would ascend those angelic choirs in their musical portal to get back into that realm of oneness and resolution of all dualities. But there came a time when that advice, you're not here to stay in that core realm, was true. And I found that remembering the musical notes of the melody no longer worked to conjure up that light portal that took me up into that rich, ultra-real Gateway Valley. To say I was sad at that point would be an understatement, but I also knew by then that I could trust, that I would be taken care of, that I had nothing to fear. And at that point, I saw thousands of beings going off around me into the distance, heads bowed, many holding candles, this murmuring energy because they were saying something, but I couldn't understand the words because my amnesia was still very much in effect, and that affected my language. And so in that setting, the surprising thing to me was I felt this beautiful sense of love and being in a spiritual home. The same that I'd felt in the Gateway Valley and on into that core realm. And I'll remind people that as I reported in the book Proof of Heaven, in that core realm, I call that deity Om, because to me, God was a puny little human word when I came back to this world. And it didn't do justice. And I realized it didn't matter if you want to call that deity Om, God, Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh, Great Spirit. All of that is irrelevant. The loving, powerful, personal nature, mercy, and acceptance that is the hallmark of that infinitely loving God force. That's what we need to focus on. And that's why I called it God. It's a resolution of all of our current religious systems to teach us that the religions that focus totally on unconditional love, mercy, acceptance, and kindness, that's it. If a religion is fomenting conflict, ideologies like ours is better than theirs, we rise above this, we're exclusive, we do not include those other souls and beings, then that religion has obviously lost its way. It no longer follows the original message of the prophets and needs to be discarded. But really, this is a resolution in many ways of all of this under the science of consciousness. So it turns out that I saw those beings, and then the very last thing I saw in the journey were 6 faces that would kind of bubble up out of the muck. They'd say a few words, disappear. I didn't understand the words because of my amnesia, but the faces were very important, and I can remember them visually right now as if they'd just appeared to me this morning. That's how sharp the appearance was. And yet when I first saw them, I didn't recognize them because of the amnesia. And it turns out that it was the last of those faces that had the most to do with my coming back to this world. That was the face of a 10-year-old boy. It turns out it was my son Bond, even though because of my amnesia, I still did not recognize him and did not understand his words. That was day 7 of coma. The doctors held a family conference where they said I'd gone from 10% chance of survival down to 2% with no chance of recovery. And that it was time to take me off the ventilator and stop the antibiotics and just let me go. They had protected Bond from the worst news during that week, but he overheard that conversation, came running down the hallway, opened up my eyelids, which were taped shut as I lay there on my ventilator. And one eye looking over there, one eye over there, neither pupil working. Any of you in medicine know that's a horrible picture. And I promise you, I did not see him with my eyes. I didn't hear him with my ears. I was very far gone from this world, deep in that spiritual realm, in the process of dying and leaving this world forever. But then that pleading of his got through to me. Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. I didn't understand the words, but that link was very strong. And so through this entire journey, I thought this can continue, it can cease, doesn't matter. But now all of a sudden, everything mattered. There was another soul out there, and I sensed a tremendous responsibility I had to that other soul. It's the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire existence, was clawing my way back to this world. Somehow my higher soul was able to navigate that way back. And soon thereafter, I was waking up on the ICU bed, fighting the ventilator, and they finally pulled out the breathing tube. I said, thank you. And I don't remember much of those first 36 hours or so of waking up. I was in and out of this paranoid, delusional, psychotic nightmare. I do know that initially when I woke up, I didn't even recognize loved ones at the bedside, my mother, my sisters, my sons. I had no idea who these beings were. All I knew was where I had just been on that extraordinary spiritual journey that seemed to go for months or years, even though it had to fit within 7 Earth days. And in fact, those faces that appeared at the end showed me that the vast majority of the coma journey had to happen between days 1 and 4 or 1 and 5. And we explain all the timing of that in Proof of Heaven and in Living in a Mindful Universe. But it turns out that finally my mind did start kind of stabilizing. And after those first 36 hours with that paranoid, delusional, psychotic nightmare, I was indeed coming back to this world. It had been very frightening for my family initially because they saw me waking up, but then saw that my mental state was absolutely frightening. Some of the things I was saying and doing, they could tell I was in kind of a psychotic place. But I also knew that, very different from the memories of what had happened deep in coma. Those memories from deep coma, the spiritual memories that are reported in the book Proof of Heaven, are as sharp today as if the whole thing happened yesterday. Whereas the memories of that paranoid, delusional, psychotic nightmare, 36 hours, during that period after awakening from coma, those memories disappeared within a few weeks. So I'm glad I wrote a lot of that down, because that's how I have that, documentation of my experiences. But very important to point out that the memories from the deep coma journey that happened when my brain was most demonstrably offline and unable to remember things occurred, and allowed me to remember every bit of it. So that's the thing about near-death experiences, is they completely violate what much of modern neuroscience would say is even possible about consciousness and about memory. In fact, in our third book, Living in a Mindful Universe, we go into a lot of the current argument that memories are not even stored in the brain. It's one of the last nails in the coffin of materialist neuroscience. But I've spent the last 15 years since my coma working with scientists around the world, trying to come to a deeper understanding of the nature of consciousness and what this all means for all of us. And it's a tremendous lesson indeed, because ultimately it demands a 180-degree flip from our prior false beliefs of materialism, believing that the brain creates consciousness, that when our brain and body die, that's the end of conscious awareness. That is a myth of materialist science that's not at all supported by the data. In fact, the data, the study of near-death experiences, shared death experiences, which are just like near-death in many ways, but often happen in perfectly healthy people. And then you have after-death communications. You have all the hospice work of Christopher Kerr of showing that when people die in hospice, they go through the very same processes that we've been describing for decades that near-death experiencers go through. They reunite with souls of departed loved ones. That's not wishful thinking and imagination. That's actually the imprimatur stamp of approval and authentication that means this is a true experience, because they're mind melding basically with souls of those who've left the world. And yet through all these different lines of evidence, you can show that that is a real experience informed by the actual communication from those loving souls. And when you combine all this with the additional information from quantum physics, from neuroscience, philosophy of mind, parapsychology, non-local consciousness, every bit of it, as we do in Living in a Mindful Universe in our third book, you start to realize how the paradigm is shifting dramatically. And that's what allows for the power of things like hypnotic regression to uncover past lives and lives between lives, and all of that having a basis in reality that helps all of us come to a richer understanding of our existence.
Talking about that, first of all, thank you for telling this story. I appreciate it so much. I was feeling the emotional journey as you were speaking. And for me, the most heightened awareness of what you experienced was actually the struggle of getting back to life to your son. That felt like the biggest, most intentional pull through. So I really appreciate the importance of that in the story. And you mentioned past lives. And I have to tell you, as I was listening to you speak, I was wondering if you had answered for yourself, what is the reason you took on this assignment in this life? In other words, is it connected to another lifetime? Have you experienced it through past life regression? Because of your scientific training, you're truly the most solid flag bearer for such a blend of a new consciousness, spirituality, and science moving forward in a whole new direction, right? And you're paving the way for so many people. And so I wonder, what is the reason this happened to you, right? As we think in terms of the bigger picture.
Well, that is a wonderful question. And although I have been through some past life regressions and life between life regressions in an effort to answer exactly that question, I cannot say that I've ever received kind of a dramatic picture of events in a prior life that absolutely explains my journey in this life. I can say I've become quite a believer in the whole notion of soul agreements, that in many ways our higher souls and soul group plan various events to occur in this lifetime. And the way I see that is it plans hardships and challenges. And in fact, given that we do have free will, your decisions at certain junction points along that pathway can lead to new pathways. So it's not as if everything is laid out in a purely predetermined fashion. But I would say that certain optional challenges are laid out all along the way to help guide our soul groups. And, it's never an evolution of an individual soul. It's always kind of the soul group. And ultimately, it's all of consciousness. It's doing the evolving through this process. But what I came to realize was a very powerful sense of my own soul agreement, of my higher soul, of coming into this lifetime and proving myself worthy of love. Now, what I mean by that is when you read the book Proof of Heaven, you realize that a huge part of my backstory is that I was adopted. My birth mother was an unwed 16-year-old. And although she and my birth father wanted to keep me, at age 11 days, I showed failure to thrive. I think it had to do, I could kind of sense the lack of cohesiveness in the home that I was with that birth mother. She was actually in a home for unwed mothers in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I think I sensed that kind of angst that she was facing, and that's why I stopped eating. And babies that are left behind by their mothers will do that. They'll basically feel they don't belong in the world, so they go on a hunger strike. And that's kind of what I did. That's why I was hospitalized at age 11 days. But the problem was my birth mother then was not really ready to let me go. And so she would not sign off on the papers for adoption until I was 4 months old. And so I really got stuck in a baby dorm for 4 months because of that situation. Now, I could not have been more fortunate and blessed. I was adopted into a wonderful, loving family. But for much of my life, I think there was that subconscious doubt as to whether or not I was worthy of existence, whether I was worthy of love. And I think that had some influence on my relationships with people. And, basically, I think was reflected in a certain lack of trust for the world. And I know that I went through my life and in many ways was kind of struggling to answer that question. And you can bet that my near-death experience, at age 54, back in 2008, went light years towards answering that question in the affirmative, that absolutely I was worthy of that love of the universe at large, every bit of it. That was the positive affirmative answer I got in my near-death experience. But in fact, I actually had to go through a dark night of the soul to even get there. And this story is all there in Proof of Heaven for people who want to hear more. But in that book, I describe how I'd gone through my life, with this adoptive family. I'd given up on looking for my birth mother. I didn't think my birth father was even out there anymore. I thought my only potential connection was with the birth mother. But even in my 20s, I would write letters to the children's home in North Carolina, and I'd always receive the same answer: she's not looking for you, so forget about it. And so that was fine for me. Like I said, I was adopted in a wonderful, loving family. They honored all my hopes and dreams, so my life was going well. But then fast forward to the year 2000. My older son, Eben the fourth, was doing a family project, a school project in family genealogy. And he said, Dad, we need to reach out to your birth family again. So I thought, okay, fine, I'll humor him. I'll write a letter to the children's home. So I wrote another letter, expecting to get the same answer I'd always gotten before: she's not there, forget about her. But I didn't. I got a very different answer. And I tell that story in Proof of Heaven. I was driving up to Maine to go skiing with my son, Eben, who was in 6th grade at the time. He was in the back seat. And I remembered, oh, yeah, the social worker said to call her today, Friday afternoon. She might have some news. So I called her up, and she said, well, I do have some news. Are you sitting down? Well, I was driving through a blizzard, but I was sitting down. And she said, well, your birth parents got married. I cannot tell you what a shocker that was. Absolute stunning to find out my birth parents got married. That's when I pulled over to the side of the road to sit down. And that's when she said, and they had 3 children, but your youngest sister died 2 years ago. That would have been in 1998. And she said, because of that, their loss, they're still grieving that. So it's not a good time for you to come back in their lives. And I didn't realize it until much later. I read in the adoption literature how a second abandonment by a birth parent in adult life of an adoptee can really tip you over the edge. And I didn't realize it till months later, but I stopped taking my sons to church. I stopped saying prayers with them at night. Beginning in February 2000, I went through a dark night of the soul because of this perceived rejection from my birth mother that really led me down deep. I stopped believing in a loving personal God. That was a belief I had basically gotten from my father, who was a scientist. He was a chairman of a neurosurgical training program, very intelligent, but he also had a very beautiful relationship with a loving personal God and the power of prayer. He used it in his healing as a neurosurgeon. But for me, growing up in the 60s and 70s, I'd always kind of struggled with that. And now, after that rejection by my birth family, even though it was actually kind of made up by the social worker, she didn't have enough information for that conclusion. But that was kind of the story she put together, that it wasn't a good time to come back in their lives because North Carolina still had very strict laws in that time trying to prevent adoptees from reuniting with their birth family. I even heard of cases where birth dates were altered on a birth certificate just to make it harder for an adoptee to reconnect with their birth family. So that tells you how big a wall they were trying to build. And so that's why, 7 years later, a year before my coma, walking in a beach in South Carolina, 2 of my adopted sisters said, don't you think it's time you reached out to your birth family again? My first response was no, because I remembered how that kind of kicked me over the abyss back in 2000. But I knew they were right. They could sense there was still a hole within me that I needed to fill. I needed to at least try to reach out again. And that's when I wrote another letter to the children's home. And this time I got a positive response back from my birth family. It was anonymous, but they were willing to get together. By then, the laws had relaxed a lot. So it turns out in 2007, October 5th, I walked down a sidewalk in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And for the first time in 54 years, I hugged my birth mother. And minutes later, I hugged my birth father. And the next days of that weekend, I met my birth brother and sister who was still living. And then in weeks and months afterwards, beach time with other extended family and relatives on that beautiful reunion, but always a bit bittersweet because of that beautiful sister that was lost. And of course, those who've read Proof of Heaven, I won't go into any more detail here and now, but those who've read Proof of Heaven will realize just how crucial that reunion with my birth family was. And it turns out that 4 months after my coma, Kathy, the living birth sister, sent me a picture of my lost birth sister. And that's when I really connected all the dots. In fact, it brought me to my knees when I realized that connection. And that is what showed me the reality of my spiritual journey during the near-death experience by identifying that beautiful guardian angel on the butterfly wing. And the rest of it for me has been an extraordinary journey of uncovering that love of the universe and coming to a deeper understanding of how all of us can come into wholeness and healing by reaching deep and discovering these beautiful kind of landmarks and other points of discovery along our pathway, which can include prior lifetimes. So for me, it's been an incredible journey of discovery. And as a scientist, it's been very illuminating about a paradigm shift going on in the scientific world now about the brain-mind relationship and the nature of reality.
Wow. I have so many questions. But the first one I will ask you is, going back, is there a reason that do you recall setting up this life the way it turned out? Your family, your the biological family, and how the sister was actually your guide. It made me cry. And so do you put the two together? Did you understand?
Oh, very much. I mean, one thing that really has been beautiful about all of this is it's demanded a much higher kind of vision of soul groups and soul connections. So I can see very clearly how my birth family and that long history going back of their origins combines with my adoptive family and their history going back. And every bit of it kind of spells forward the kind of lessons I was to learn from living this life as, you know, the biological result of my biological family, but in many ways, the kind of spiritual and soul result of my adoptive family, and that every bit of it is interrelated. So you can't say that any one part of it is more important than the other. And in a sense, I certainly have come to realize how my higher soul and soul group kind of participated in coming up with those various challenges I was to face. You know, adoption being a major one. Another one was that I struggled with alcohol in the early 1990s, very early in my career. I never had trouble with alcohol at work, but on my nights off call, I leaned pretty heavily on that tall scotch. And my family and I came to realize, you know, that was it was just not a good thing for me. And I stopped drinking alcohol. And when I look back on it all, especially with some of the broader recognitions of kind of addiction and ego toxicities and alcoholism all through that birth and adoptive family, I started realizing how these were beautiful gifts. And the gift was not just recovering from the alcohol and leaving it behind, but just like with the adoption, the gift was going through the challenge of the adoption, of the alcohol, et cetera, and then learning and growing through all that. Because in the process of dealing with those challenges in my life, that is what has led to a tremendous amount of understanding and soul growth. So I've come to embrace the hardships and challenges and realize that they're often beautiful gifts. And that includes people who we might see as difficult in our lives. Many of the people who, when I look back on my life, before coma, I might have said that person was a nemesis or an enemy. It was someone who was standing in the way of things I wanted in my life. But after my coma, it became clear to me that in many ways, we were near and dear soul mates. And we were teaching each other very tough things. It reminds me of that statement from Confucius, the Chinese philosopher, who said, if you see something objectionable in another, look inside yourself. So that, in other words, this shows us the instruction power of living these lives and learning and teaching as souls with a higher awareness, higher than the ego mind. This is something I've learned in meditation. I use sacred acoustics, which is a form of binaural beat brainwave entrainment. And the sacredacoustics.com was co-founded by my partner, Karen Newell. She's also the co-author of that third book, Living in Mindful Universe, for full disclosure. But I've used this kind of meditation daily for more than 10 years now to glean, deeper lessons from the NDE, to not only recover memories from the NDE, but to actively engage and cultivate relationships with the spiritual guides and with that God presence that I first encountered in the NDE. But I've used meditation to do that. And that is something any and all of us have the power to do, go within mind. Hypnotic regression, of course, is another way to do this. But all of these techniques, whether it's sacred acoustics, binaural beat brainwave entrainment, hypnotic regression with an optical stimulus like a pendulum, something like that, EMDR, that is eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which is commonly used to treat post-traumatic stress disorder. These all involve oscillations in the lower brainstem. And that's kind of the power. That's what liberates our conscious awareness. As a neuroscientist, I'm fascinated by binaural beats like sacred acoustics and their power to enable our conscious awareness to be set free from here, now, and that false sense of self, to realize we can navigate out into that primordial mind in beautiful ways. And these are all techniques of uncovering much deeper relationships with kind of higher soul and soul group, and leaving the little ego voice behind, because far too many people make the mistake of identifying their consciousness as being identical with that ego voice, that little running stream of thoughts in the head. And the very first thing I learned in meditation was to put that little voice in my head into timeout. I love how Michael Singer, in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls that voice in your head your annoying roommate. And that is a perfect way to describe it. Do not see that voice of running thoughts in your head as your consciousness. It's your awareness of that. That's the mystery. And that is something that goes far beyond the parlor trick of your little ego mind and linguistic brain and what it does. It's that awareness that you can start to explore. The neutral observer, as Karen and I often put it. And that's where this kind of work with using meditative techniques like sacred acoustics can be so high yielding in terms of what it gives us back about the journey.
Early on, when you were speaking about deep time, I took a note of that in my mind, and I thought to myself, I have to bring the conversation back to this. I teach about simultaneous time. I teach people how to use the idea of simultaneous time, but the way you spoke about it really provoked the desire in me to ask you to just tell us more. How do you see it? How do you practically apply it, being here and now with us, right?
Well, first I'll say that early on, I learned a very simple kind of meditative tool to help me get out of the illusion of just being here now and sense of self. And that was especially getting out of the now part of it. And what I would do is I'd go into a meditation, listening to sacred acoustics. At the very beginning, my ego mind, linguistic human voice, could make a request, what do I need to know now? It could be that wide open, or it could ask a specific question of some sort, whatever I'm looking for that particular day. But then I learned to just ride the tones and let that take me deep. But one of the key ingredients was I would go back to an early childhood memory right after that intention was stated. Go back to something back when I was at 3 or 4 or 5 years old. And then I'd start following that memory. And I'd start following that memory trace until before too long, I'd followed it into memories that I might not have had for 60 years. And just by going through that process of following memory traces and getting way outside of the here and now, had a tremendous liberating potential, especially once I learned to let my ego mind go. So I no longer have that monkey mind running around saying, what are you doing? You're wasting time in this meditation. Why don't you get up and do something? The monkey mind is put into timeout. And that's where I started really gaining some ability to navigate that much grander kind of time scale. And just start, envisioning and feeling the power, the emotional success of having a life review. So in other words, going into those early memories and starting to follow them around, start engaging with the reality of those memories and soaking in that. Before you know it, you are way escaped from this, being there meditating, lying on a bed or sitting in a chair, listening to tones, but you are out of this space and way into those earlier spaces. And you start to realize that all of it is accessible to you. And you can even then imagine future events, start imagining that whole vast scale of time that's accessible to you. But what ends up happening, especially as you go deeper and deeper in the meditation, is they become much more alive and much more like lived events. And those memories start really coming to life and having these connections that are very interesting, because in that space of kind of the eternal now, you are able to glean these interrelationships across space and time that otherwise are not so visible. And for me, that was what I call the Indra's net vision that I had during a late passage through the core realm. And that Indra's net was this beautiful vision because of my amnesia, I could not have an Eben Alexander life review, but I could absolutely witness life reviews and reincarnation writ large in this Indra's net vision that showed me the bigger scale of these human events. Even though, again, I was limited from having an Eben Alexander version because I needed that amnesia to ultimately convince me of the reality of the journey. And there are many reasons for that we go into in the third book, Living in a Mindful Universe. But that was that gives you a glimpse of kind of the emotional territory, the kind of cognitive landscape that you set up in mind in these kind of meditative episodes to help you break free of the Maya, of the illusion of being here now and just locked into a sense of self, and enables you to be a far grander, especially when you go into that with the knowledge that life reviews often involve the experiencing of all of these events from other people's perspective. So in other words, going into that, I start feeling the emotional power of my actions on those around me. And as I feel that emotionally, kind of in the heart, that's when I start to relive it, and it starts to serve up as a life review that actually allows us to relive those events. And in many ways, all of that process nudges us towards this kind of higher growth of soul, towards an understanding of oneness, how we're all sharing the dream of the one mind. All of this starts to become more visible as you go through that kind of process. But an essential part of it is escaping the issues of the here and now and the little self. The ego uses fear and anxiety. That's the two tools it has to use. Addictions are always rooted in problems with the ego. And often in a psychological setting or psychiatric setting, you have to go through a ritual sacrifice of the ego to allow its rebirth in a more healthy form. Meditation is a beautiful way to address all of this in our own lives and help us come into this sense of higher self, higher soul that ultimately is interconnected with all the other souls in our journey.
Wow. So I want to ask you, I know we are kind of running out of time, but I have so many questions that you can, only the one that can answer. One of the questions that you just brought up was, how did you perceive the higher self and the soul compared to source?
What I see there is that source is ultimately the true source of conscious awareness. I mean, that part was crystal clear from the core. I mean, it was a lesson that we're never any farther removed from that infinitely powerful God force than right at the core of our conscious awareness. So we really don't have to go anywhere to experience that. What happens is we start realizing that all the world around us, the material world, four-dimensional space-time, in many ways is set up from within the realm of consciousness of that one mind to give us this kind of illusion that the physical universe exists independently of us. And yet quantum physics has been trying for a century to drive us into realizing that none of that exists without the observing mind, and that our existence as a soul is absolutely essential to the emergence of our experience of a world out there. And this is where it all gets very interesting, but it's really one of the most beautiful lessons about this. And this is where I think the scientific community is really helping people to get on board. But it's viewing the brain as a filter or transceiver that allows that primordial mind to express through a process of dissociation, so that we have these little eddy currents of the one mind that we think are our own. But in parapsychology, there are millions of examples of how telepathy, a sense of empathy that involves a true communication between minds, intuition of what's going on with others, beyond our normal sensory channels. All these things are real. And the more we use to develop them, the more we can kind of grow into that higher soul that ultimately is sourced in source. That's why it's called source. But that ultimately, and at that level of, say, the Gateway Valley, at the level where life reviews happen, that's where we realize we're all in this together. One of the most common features of life reviews is that you feel like you're experiencing from the perspective of others who were affected by your thoughts and actions. So if you've been busy handing out pain and suffering to others or being selfish or greedy, you have to be on the receiving end of that during the life review, which is not necessarily fun. In fact, I think our very concepts of hell in many ways have come from life reviews where somebody had been very greedy or selfish or handed out a lot of pain and suffering, and then that life review was not fun to go through. That's not always a source of a distressing NDE. There are other possibilities, but I think in many cases, the hellish NDE, which is only about 5% of near-death experiences in general, but those hellish ones or distressing ones, I think are often associated with that life review from someone who's very greedy or selfish or handed out a lot of pain and suffering. So that's all the more reason to learn these lessons now so that we live our lives most effectively with the most growth possible. And that means showing love, kindness, compassion, acceptance, and mercy to all of our fellow beings. That's really the deep lesson of NDEs for all of us.
Wow. And I'm going to ask one last question, Mira, if it's okay. How does it look for the scientific community or the medical science books to reflect what you're bringing on? Because as you said, quantum physics has been around from the turn of the century, and I don't believe that it's being taught in universities, right?
No, it is taught in universities, absolutely, but it's taught from a kind of a materialist perspective. But that is why it is so critical for people to realize, many people think that science is scientific materialism. Other people, when they think of science, they're actually practicing what's known as scientism, which is a faith-based religion that says that the only knowledge worth knowing comes from the scientific method. But I'll remind you that Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in quantum physics, said in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech that there was a tremendous amount of truth that would come to be known that would not be gained from the scientific method. So he was pointing out that some of it goes beyond materialist science. And that's where it's important for people to get that the modern quantum-informed science of consciousness is what really takes us to the next level. It's very telling that in the year 2022, the Nobel Prize in Physics was given to 3 scientists who had done work over the last 5 decades, showing the reality of entanglement, spooky action at a distance, as Einstein called it. And entanglement is absolutely a phenomenon of modern science that completely transcends our notions of local realism. That is, that a world exists locally and that all of physics is local, that is, particles interacting with particles, and also the notion of realism that an objective world exists independently of our observation. And what entanglement says is no, local realism is no longer it. Therefore, four-dimensional space-time, the very fabric of all of materialist science, is not going to be fully explanatory. There are deeper levels of interconnection revealed through entanglement. And once scientists get over their kind of sticker shock, they've got to realize they're looking for some material particle out there to explain that entanglement, or some kind of hidden variables doesn't explain it. That's what all these experiments over 5 decades have proven to us, that it truly is spooky action at a distance, this entanglement beyond space and time. And once they just follow the lead, for example, of John Wheeler, a renowned Princeton physicist, a quantum physicist in the Manhattan Project, et cetera. And he came up with a participatory anthropic principle, which is basically a statement that mind and the decisions of the observing scientists play a crucial role that ultimately are proving to you that mind is not something simply derivative from physical matter of the brain and that kind of thing. And once you kind of carry that to the next level, you'll realize that this entanglement that they're talking about, that connection beyond space and time, is very simply the mental layer of the universe. It's a layer that's always existed. One of the problems in mid-20th century was scientists thought, well, wait a minute, consciousness is a human phenomenon. So how can we explain this primordial consciousness? They didn't realize that humans borrow it from the universe, that layer of information assimilation and integration, that self-awareness of the universe was something that pre-existed the Big Bang. And by simply acknowledging that we're accessing that mental layer of the universe, you start to realize how this thing called entanglement, that connection of information beyond space and time, is very simply the mental layer that we're used to thinking in anyway. Entangled minds, entangled particles, all of it is reflections of the very same process. And this is where the science can grow tremendously. Living in a Mindful Universe, our third book. People can learn more at ebenalexander.com. But that book goes into great detail in every bit of this. For those who want to dive in extremely deep with a scientific dive, I would recommend the books of Ed Kelley. Ed Kelley, Jim Tucker, and Bruce Grayson, who all work at University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, they all endorsed our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, but I certainly have endorsed their work strongly, and that includes Ed Kelley's trilogy of world-changing scientific books on this topic of consciousness. His first book, Irreducible Mind, 2007, I believe. Then 2015 came Beyond Physicalism. And finally, in March of 2021, his third book in this trilogy that he's served as an editor, many other brilliant writers, authors contributing these books, but the third one is Consciousness Unbound. And these books all basically point towards evolutionary panentheism as the ultimate answer. Panentheism being that the God force, that unifying primordial mind, is within all of reality and it reflects itself through sentient beings. Evolutionary means free will is absolutely involved in the process. You know, materialist scientists will scoff at you if you claim to have free will, but that's because they're wrong. Free will is alive and well, but it's because materialism and, brain creates consciousness is not true. But what is true is a form of the brain filtering or serving as a transceiver for that primordial mind. And that's where all of this starts to fit together into a much grander picture, where free will is essential. That's where we see the free will of sentient beings guiding the evolution of our emerging reality. It's not just some bottom-up causality, of the subatomic particles through the laws of physics, chemistry, biology, giving us an emergent reality based on those natural laws. But free will is injected because ultimately it is top-down causality. George F.R. Ellis is a South African mathematician who's written extensively about top-down causality in quantum physics. But follow that pathway if you want to start understanding much more deeply where all of this is headed. But it's a unification of quantum physics, neuroscience, philosophy of mind, parapsychology, non-local consciousness. All these pieces come together in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, to paint a picture of this kind of idealism of this mental force at the core of all that is happening in the universe. But ultimately, it's spiritual. That's what's reflected by our unification.
Thank you.
There's nothing that's not spirit. Everything is
Exactly.
spirit.
I think that's the big lesson.
Yeah.
And if you want to learn more, the 10th anniversary edition of Proof of Heaven just came out. It's got 36 additional pages in it that explain a lot of this far beyond the original book. But of course, Living in a Mindful Universe, the book that was co-written with Karen Newell, with my partner, is the one that really goes light years towards unification of science and spirituality that explains all of this.
Well, I'm going to get the next edition and the third book. I'm looking forward to doing that. Thank you so much. It's been such an honor, and thank you for taking this role to be this voice, from the scientific community that will be listened to, and the way that you come across, the language that you speaks to so many more people than just a spiritual person, a layman. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And it really is all about the science. And your listeners can also go to scientificandmedical.net, galileocommission.org. Those are two websites that I'm on the scientific advisory board for both. And there are hundreds of scientists around the world who are following this pathway of understanding. So that's just a beginning at those two websites to help people get up to speed.
Thank you. And we will we'll write them down too, so
Yes.
people
Great.
can have them. Yeah. Thank you again.
Sharon and Mira, thank you so much for having me on. Great being with you both today. Thanks.
Same here. Thank you much.
It was
All
wonderful
right.
to have you. Bye for now.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.